Welcome to today's webinar on exploring career trajectories, a discussion of academic and non-academic pathways. We're really excited about today's webinar. It's part of the efforts of the National Research Center on Hispanic Children and Families to build capacity and strengthen and advance the next generation of emerging scholars in the field. Before I go into the details of the actual event, I want to talk a little bit about a few logistical items. If you have any technical questions, please submit them using the Q&A box at the bottom of your panel, and you can also use that box to submit some questions, because we hope to have some opportunity for folks to weigh in with some questions as we go through the different presentations. And we'll have some of those. We'll have some time at the end of the presentation to be able to field some questions from the audience. Also, please follow us at with the Hispanic Center, and you see on the screen. You can also tweet with us during the event. So just a few words for those not familiar with the Hispanic Center. The National Research Center on Hispanic Children and Families was originally founded in 2013 through a grant from the Office of Planning, Research, and Evaluation within the Department of Health and Human Services. The center's mission is to conduct research and provide research-based information to inform programs and policies supporting low-income Hispanic children and families around four major areas: poverty and self-sufficiency, healthy marriage and responsible fatherhood, and early care and education, as well as cross-cutting issues that span across these areas. Because we aim to inform program and policies, our research focuses on low-income Hispanics. In addition to our research activities, we also fulfill our mission through capacity building activities to strengthen the capacity of the research field and expand the pipeline of scholars focused on Hispanic children and families. And we do this through three main strands of work. We provide resources to the field by developing a range of innovative resources, tools, and training activities with a Hispanic lens. Today's webinar is one of those examples of the type of capacity building efforts focused on supporting emerging scholars. We have a whole other strand focusing on supporting emerging scholars through other activities like mentoring and networking activities, and then also engaging in key stakeholders through a range of outreach and engagement activities, conferences, newsletters, among other efforts. The center represents a partnership of research and academic organizations, including Child Trends, NRC at the University of Chicago, and three universities: Duke University, University of Maryland College Park, and University of North Carolina, Greensboro, as well as our federal partner, the Office of Planning, Research, and Evaluation within the Administration for Children and Families. Just a quick note of disclaimer: the views expressed today are those don't necessarily reflect the views or policies of the Office of Planning, Research, and Evaluation, NACF, but are those of the presenters. So what's our goal today? Our goal today is really to highlight various strategies and decision-making points along the path for both academic and non-academic career trajectories. With a lot of the mentoring activities that we have done over the years, we're constantly getting questions from emerging scholars around, how do I think about choosing a career path? What are some of those options? How do people do this? How do they think about academic versus non-academic jobs? And I think the non-academic job opportunities tend to be those that are less well known from advisors and from graduate training. And so I think that has been a recurring theme, and we have the opportunity to put together today's webinar as one step of the process of trying to make it more transparent and help share some wisdom and experiences that some of us have had along the way. So just what was interesting is we looked a little bit as people were registering to get a feel for who's joining us today. And based on the information as of this morning, it was nice to see there was a nice mix of participants, a lot of graduate students, it appears, but also some undergraduate students or those who have just started their graduate programs. Then there's quite a few. There seems to be a large percentage, 42% of folks who are trying to decide between an academic and non-academic career. And so of the options, it seems like we've hit that sweet spot of that people, sweet spot of interest that people are struggling with about the career decision-making processes. And some even who are identified, 23% identified as they're focusing on exploring a non-academic career trajectory. So our goal is not to pit one versus the other. We wanted to try and represent a mix of perspectives and experiences, so that as you will hear today, we have panels who represent different perspectives from both of these major career paths. And our goal is to really talk a lot about some of these different decision-making points along the way, not necessarily that you're going to follow the exact same career trajectory as Cynthia Garcia-Cole or any of the other panelists, but really trying to understand some of those processes that went into, or decisions that have gone into various folks' decision-making processes. So I'd like to take a quick moment and introduce our panelists for today. First up, my name is Michael Lopez. I'm Vice President for Education and Child Development at NORC at the University of Chicago, and also co-principal investigator for the Hispanic Center. Lorena Acevedo is a first-generation Latina doctoral candidate and IES pre-doctoral fellow from Penn State University, their Department of Human Development and Family Studies. Cynthia Garcia-Cole is an American developmental psychologist and current editor-in-chief of Child Development. She currently teaches at the University of Puerto Rico Medical Science campus. And then Kevin Ferrier-Ben-Lear is a former grad student and now an assistant professor in the Department of Undergraduate Studies and Education at Cal State University, Sacramento. And so as you can see, Kevin and Lorena bring the perspective of the more recent emerging scholars in terms of Kevin having just gone through the job search process, and Lorena, who is nearing the end of her graduate career and will be on the job market. So those folks who are interested in getting new talent have a good prospect right here. And then Cynthia and I will represent the other end of the spectrum and bring in some of the experiences that we've had. So we've designed this as a panel format, and the idea is that we're going to have 3 different rounds where each of the panels is going to share a little bit on 3 general topical areas around career trajectories, sharing some of their experiences and really focusing on how the kinds of input and information that might be helpful for those of you who are out there who are struggling or thinking about your own career trajectories. And hopefully these insights will be helpful. But again, we look forward to sharing this information, but then also having some time at the end for some exchange and then for some questions from the audience. So our first round is that we're looking at just basically an individual's background and career trajectory, kind of how they've gotten to where they are now, and what are some of those major events and key decision-making processes, and even mentoring relationships that have influenced their career trajectory. So why don't we start? Maybe Cynthia, why don't we start with you, since this is kind of a long-term career trajectory perspective, and so why don't we start with you?
Okay, so let's be sure that I stick to the 3 minutes. That's only when you give a free pass to an academic, you know what can happen. So good afternoon, good morning to everybody. So let's talk about the first question. What are the major events, key decision-making processes, and mentoring relationships? Although I've been an academic my whole life, and that's what I had planned from the very beginning, you know, my career has not been a linear career at all. And so what are the major events? When I came out with my PhD, there were no jobs where I was living, and it was a regional search because I had my husband at the time, also PhD psychologist in the same area. We wanted to be in the same place. So one of the things that happens is that when we have this idea about what careers are all about, many of these ideals come from a vacuum of what relationships, meaning family and other relationships, are all about, that you want to maintain or foster or change. So in terms of decision making, you know, my search was really something that was very much to a particular area. And so that was it. There was certain sort of limitations that were part of where I was in terms of my life trajectory at the same time. So we always have to think about that careers and life trajectories to a certain extent have to merge and inform each other. My mentors was really interesting. I had a mentor who was a top of the field person in my area who had no idea about women's life trajectory, no idea about dealing with things that had to do with being non-mainstream, trying to do research that doesn't fit into whatever it was that at that point that was thought of as important. So for that reason, the mentoring was not there. I had a second mentor in my particular committee that, you know, we're very good friends still. His name is Dante Cicchetti, and Dante and I have been together since the beginning. I started grad school when he started being a professor, and we've gone through life sort of, you know, joined by the hip. So finding people like that that really capture both. I had the traditional academic worldview, and I had the sort of my own personality, person, woman, minority perspective from another mentors. So I always talk about mentors rather than mentor. So how did my own background as a diverse scholar play a role? Well, I had to, at the very beginning in my PhD program, really become a mainstream researcher. I learned everything that needed to be learned about what science was all about, what developmental science was all about, what were the key standards and everything else. And at the same time, be able to connect that with my own life experience and what I wanted to do in the future. So I did not start my career dealing, I was in the temperament field for a while. And thus, you know, it was something that it was a dual career at the very beginning. And so one of the things that I think are important instead of strategies, resources, and relationships is that I needed both. I needed key relationships on how to deal with making it in the mainstream at the same time that I was dealing with my own experience and what I needed and what I wanted to do in the future. For the first 10 years of my career, I basically had a dual CV that it was intertwining itself over the point. Is that
Cynthia, so that's a point that I want to come back to when we
yes?
When we talk about some of the third area in terms of advice for other junior scholars. But I want to make sure that we also give some of the other panelists an opportunity
Sure.
to weigh in. But that's a great way to start us off. Lorena, how about you? How would you address this question?
I kind of would talk about my career, like my trajectory to the PhD actually started back in undergrad when I joined the McNair Scholars Program as an undergrad, kind of by accident. I got an email and they're like, oh, like we're looking for students who are interested in research and how they can make a career out of it by pursuing a PhD. And I was like, oh, I didn't know you could do research. And at the time, I didn't even know what a PhD was. So I applied, and sure enough, due to all the experience I had, I was accepted. And going through the program, I learned, and their focus was definitely on the academic track, is taking students to go to become professors. So that's what I was focused on starting grad school. Like, you know, I've been taught to be that's where I'm headed, and you know, this is my future. So I go into grad school, and I actually ended up at Penn State just due to different advice that I got on putting myself in a position where I could learn to be uncomfortable, because, you know, my McNair director at the time and my current advisor always have reminded me that being of Latina, a student of color moving into the world of PhDs, you're unfortunately going to be surrounded with a lot of people who are white and in a lot of environments that are not diverse. So I took, you know, the plunge and decided, you know, get the best training and also learn to be uncomfortable because this is where I'm headed and this is my future. So I went ahead and did that and been at Penn State. And then, so like I say, the mentoring relationships have been really key. And then being in grad school, I realized that there's actually abundance of opportunities outside of academia that I didn't realize because all I had known coming from McNair and going into a prestigious university that this is, you know, you're training to be a professor. And then especially being, I think, like a student of color, you want to be that next generation training other students of color. But then also just being a diverse scholar and having grown up with my parents both being undocumented immigrants, I wanted to be in a space where I could help more directly. And I realized that academia might not be that space where I could do this kind of work. So I started exploring what I could do right in the middle of grad school and trying to figure that out. And I would say that the relationships I have with my advisor and people I've met at conferences have been really crucial, like opening where I'm going and kind of figuring out what these different things mean to me. And I think it's a lot about just conversation and like self-reflection about your skills and like your goals and where you're headed. So I think it's just a really opportunity, like a chance for students when they're like exploring to like kind of think about these different things and how they shape into your trajectory.
Well, one thing that I'd like to come back to on what you said, because I think there's a lot there, but not only the being uncomfortable, but also the self-reflection and the vulnerability that often we create this aura that as grad students that it's hard to show vulnerability. It's hard to show that you're not perfect, you're not superhuman, because of the concern that people are going to judge me, that I'm not good enough, I'm not a stellar researcher. And so I think that's a thing I want to come back to as we talk about some of the advice going forward. Like, how can you put yourself in those uncomfortable positions and show some of that vulnerability in a productive way, without it compromising your career trajectory. Kevin.
Yeah, thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, folks. I almost want to start with the second question and really touch on some things that other folks have said, but how is my background as a diverse scholar? I think for me, something that moved me into a PhD program and on my career was coming from a migrant family and thinking about kind of growing up in that tension, kind of the acculturation tension of my own family and some of the mainstream cultures I participated in. Thinking about how to weigh those is what led me to a PhD, in thinking about the family and community values that I grew up with. And I was working as a community organizer on access to education for migrant families. And it was working in New York City, actually. It was a book by, on a study that Hiro Yoshikawa had done about immigrants raising citizens, and seeing how that book, in passing it along to policymakers, changed the narrative with the stakeholders on the city level around access, that said, wow, research might be a place to continue to advocate and to work for the communities I'm a part of. And that's how I began my search. And I say that because I think as part of that reflection process, reminding yourself why you went into a PhD program, why you thought about research, or if you're mentoring others, thinking about what drove you through the tough moments, and being vulnerable and reminding yourself of that is important. And that leads me to a couple of major events. I think one strategy that I used is it's okay, and this could be my community organizing background, is it's okay to break rules. So I know programs vary in how they recommend working alongside programs. Depending on where you're situated, you might be receiving a stipend or not. And I know a lot of folks have worked through their program, even though programs may encourage them not to. And I harness that to continue to kind of consult on the side, doing research with communities. And those relationships that I built were key. So breaking the rules to, I think, play outside of the bounds of research that you might be asked to be doing within programs, or to apply that in new ways, could be a way to gain experience and build relationships. And for me, that helped me build relationships that allowed me to be more vulnerable than I could to my mentor relationships in my graduate program. So I was working for a small human rights foundation, Unitarian Universalist Service Committee, working on their research team. And the researcher was someone who had come from an academic position and now was working there. And it was in conversations with her that really led me, ironically, to come back to an academic position. But it was my ability to talk about the ways that research could be used in communities and impact the communities that I'm a part of that allowed me to broaden my perspective as well as gain experience. So I think finding a mentor outside, it doesn't need to be outside of academic settings, but outside of the setting that you're in because of the relationships that pop up in graduate studies is very important, as well as thinking about breaking some rules and being creative with what you are doing, considering many of us have many facets of our lives outside of a graduate program, although sometimes we don't admit it. I think the other place that I wanted to talk about was thinking and staying true to what drove you. And a lot of us struggle with the research that's presented to us and how that reflects our communities. We already heard a little bit about this. And I think finding ways and finding folks and places that allow you to conduct that type of research. So for me, it was, what are the issues and what are the local knowledge that I can formalize and investigate together with communities that I'm a part of, allowed me to really stay true to what this research was about. And I found a way, and I'll come back to this, to do that in an academic setting. But I think it's playing with those tensions of mainstream research and what are our concerns as folks from the margins coming in that helped bring me clarity in making a number of decisions going forward.
Great. Thanks, Kevin. I love the theme of breaking rules because you stole my thunder. And for me, I sometimes think of my career trajectory as the accidental tourist. Although I don't even remember the whole plot to that movie, but I really and Kevin knows this because we met at a mentoring event. But part of what I see is I could not have planned my career trajectory if I had tried, and part of that was the message out of that is that there are many opportunities that will come your way, and we all want to be planful, we all want to be thoughtful, we all want to get, for those who are still in grad school, want to get your degrees done. But I think one of the things that I've learned the most about my own process has been, there are those things that you can plan. You can plan your career study, you can plan your research, you can plan, where you think you're going to be, where you think you want to go, based on everything that people have said. I love Kevin's theme of breaking the rules. I like to think of it as being creative and not being limited by kind of traditional mainstream efforts. And that really applies as a diverse scholar doing work on issues of diversity, disparity, or equity. But for me, it was, if I hadn't stopped to take advantage of some of the opportunities that just dropped on my lap, I would be in a totally different place. And I think that is a very important, for me, it's a very important thing, because I couldn't have predicted how I would have gotten into some of the different scenarios of, my training was in child clinical psychology, and I was on a career trajectory to do a combination of clinical teaching and research, and actually accepted a position at UCLA. So I thought I was going to be on that kind of traditional trajectory. And then that's when the unexpected happened. And because of some of the relationships, another important theme, really being able to, got caught with a little bit of the policy bug, and Kevin kind of touched on this, and started doing some work seeing that, wow, I can have an impact, I can do some research work to have an impact on policy issues that will have an impact on a larger number of people, children, families, than I could do if I were just doing clinical work. I loved clinical work, but that kind of got me going at the state level, and then kind of went to the national level, and being able to come in and help shape research agendas, influencing some of the programs and policy decision-making, has been a huge, a huge draw, and something that I kind of stumbled into at best. So there was not the planfulness, it was really just when those opportunities came up, I really took advantage of them. And so I would kind of put that out as one of the big key themes in terms of my own trajectory, that I think, if I had to do it all over, I would really try and be more intentional about that. So that's, I'll stop with that. But let's move on to the next category. So in this next category, some people have touched upon it in terms of their own backgrounds. For those who are thinking between the academic and non-academic jobs, you've heard a little bit of what people have said about what they've been contemplating. Like Cynthia had always intended on doing the academic trajectory, and you're hearing some of the others. But so now let's talk a little bit about how you made these decisions, or how you were in the process of making decisions, and go from there. Kevin, how about you want to start us off on this one?
Yeah.
Since you were the one that just most recently got a job, so maybe you can talk a little bit about this in terms of your background.
Yeah, so I learned to be organized as I was in graduate school. So I never made the decision about an academic or non-academic career track before I joined the job market. I tried to keep both open, despite being told that one might be better than another for me. And I tried to stay central and say, what is it that I want out of a job, out of an ideal job? And I was lucky in the sense that I think I had enough of a network to be able to have the liberty, or kind of the privilege, to say, okay, what is the ideal position for me? Because I felt like there was at least one or two things I could fall back on. So I do want to acknowledge that. But I laid out and I said, okay, I want to be doing work with communities around issues that they're presenting, coming forward in the area of developmental psych, and be able to ideally have some mentorship relationships and teach, but not necessarily want to become a professor. And that outlined then kind of three different areas: kind of faculty roles, administrative roles, as well as nonprofit or think tank type roles. And I looked for previous job positions that might fit the bill and use those as exemplars. And I went back to this when I was preparing for this. I have a sheet that with my mentors, I shared with them, that was 2 pages of here's are the types of jobs I'm looking for. And I really only made the decision to be in an academic track when that's the one of the opportunities that kind of bit and seemed to be the best fit with the opportunities available to me at the time. And I say that in that I think some folks think I think careers have begun to change, and this we might hear differently, but I think we can begin to think more broadly about what we're applying to. It's asking a lot more of our mentors as far as letter writings and things, but I found that folks were willing and able to do it if I was organized, and supported them through that process of supporting me. One thing that I do want to say is that because I'm interested in working with migrant families and on issues that weren't mainstream, I've gotten the advice of having the dual track of research, which I've followed. But I also think what I heard throughout my career in grad school was an academic position doesn't sound like it's right for you. You can always adjunct if you really like teaching, because they noticed that was a skill and an interest of mine. But you should really be looking at these other positions. And I think for folks hearing that message, and a lot of us do, which is really a message of who belongs in doing research and who belongs in the academy, I think it's useful to listen to, but don't let it dominate your narrative. And that's one thing I do want to say. As well as going back to breaking rules, folks worked on various jobs alongside, and I consulted, but at one point I was told, why don't you consider mowing lawns as I was preparing to take comprehensive exams, and you could take that microaggression as you will. So I think pursuing certain options, taking advantage creatively, as Mike said, of those options available to you to build your network. And then I do want to say, I think we are prepared often in graduate programs for Research 1 university positions. I am at a public 4-year comprehensive university. There are many types of university positions: R1, R2, public, private, community college, liberal arts. And I think we need to explore more. I work at a Hispanic serving institution where more than a third of my students are Latinx, and the majority are students of color, and 1/3 are first generation. It's teaching dominated, as well as there's increasing support for research, but I would have never guessed that there was a department out there that I could join where I would be able to work with the communities and teach the communities that I wanted to work with, as well as join a department that's majority people of color. And I don't think that our mentors often know about those options. So we have to explore those for ourselves as well. So I can continue to go on about some of the differences, but I almost wanted to talk about within variation in the academy, the non-academic positions. And I'll turn it over to someone else.
Great. Lorena, how about the non-academic perspective side of the fence?
So I actually started this exploration process probably about second year in grad school, where for just a varied range of reasons, I started to wonder what was out there, and I was curious to find out. And within my third year, I went to a conference in DC, and I was I think it was a panel with WestEd, and I asked them, like, well, how do I even like start thinking, or if I'm interested in a position in one of these like research firms, how do I even explore that? And they're like, oh, get an internship. So I was like, okay, like now I need to get an internship, but like, how do I even get one? And I honestly didn't even, so I started with that. I was like, okay, let's try to get an internship somewhere to kind of just get experience outside of academia and what that might look like. And I didn't really know how to find internships until, because I'm an IES pre-doctoral fellow, we were on the listserv, and they actually sent an email about an internship at IES. And it's funny because I actually applied to, it was with like the National Center for Special Education Research, and I was like, you know, might as well give it a shot and see if I get it. I ended up not getting that position, but they forwarded my application to someone else. So I actually ended up at the National Center for Education Research, which is actually a better fit because I do education research. So I spent my summer of 2018 at IES with NCER, and it was a really great eye-opening experience to me that made me realize, kind of helped me go through the self-reflection process and helped me learn, you know, I've been only in an academic setting, and now I had the opportunity to be like full-time in a non-academic setting and, you know, pick people's brains at NCER and their different experiences and people at different levels. And actually through them, I was able to connect with a lot of people at different organizations. And it was actually my internship boss who really encouraged me to do informational interviews, which I think is a great way of kind of learning about these different spaces, whether it be academic or non-academic. And I've actually realized a lot of people are more than willing to spend 30 minutes with you over coffee, talking about their career, so that you're able to learn. And like, if you, especially if like you're interested in non-academic careers and you might not know what that process looks like, or the job interview, or, you know, talking about how do I make my CV or resume, I think this is like the best way that I was able to learn about that. And I think a lot of the main similarities and differences between academic and non-academic jobs is just kind of the different skills and different types of projects you get to work on. So I've learned that in non-academic settings, you might not be the driver of your research questions. So you're not the one creating your research questions, which for me is okay, because I realize that my skill set is actually very well used in that setting. I realize that I feel like almost like if I were at home, because I'm able to just be the researcher that I want to be in that type of setting. And some of the challenges I've realized, I think the biggest one is realizing being in a federal space, that at the PhD level, there's not many people of color. So just like academia, we also need to work on diversifying these places, especially because our population is becoming more diverse. So we need those people in those positions of power, not only in academia, but also in the non-academic setting, to reflect our diverse population, so that we have people that are advocating for, you know, our people of color, just like we need it in both spaces. So I think that's one of the challenges, and kind of like my passion for like really pursuing this non-academic route, because I'm particularly interested in the federal space and like really, you know, being one of the first to pioneer that space and, you know, really make an effort to diversify and be a reflection of, you know, our country and what we need.
Excellent points, and I want to come back to a couple of those when I, especially at decision making on the type of work you do in non-academic positions, as well as this last point in terms of being alone out there and the need for that. But Cynthia, why don't you share your thoughts?
Oh boy, I love what you guys have said in many different ways. I never consider anything but being an academic, because I'm a nerd and I love doing research and I love books. I get off on libraries, I get off on teaching. It's my passion. And what I used to say to my students at my university was, you know, how do you make a decision? Really think about what your passions are. I mean, if you really want to think about that, you want to have a program to really be hands-on, that is telling you that you need to go on that direction. If you wanna, my quest for my career was changing developmental psychology. I mean, the notion of us being bicultural people academically or anywhere we go, Lorena, as you said, we're not only the ones that are breaking into academia, we're breaking everywhere, because the position and the structure of power has always been white, male dominated. So in a certain sense, we always have to think we are changing systems that we some ones, that we're going to be the only ones doing this kind of work. All of that is part of this generation of us who are the first one that are coming into having a chance to be in a position. When we talk about differences and similarities, for me, academia has, it's like crops, right? So we go on the fall, we do this, on the spring, we do this, on the summer, we do this. There's a certain sort of non-linearity to your work versus in some other settings, I think there might be, even if they're deadlines, there's a lot more predictability. For me, as a woman having 3 children, the notion of having more control over my time, and I'm assuming that as fathers are getting more involved into family life, having more control, for me, that's what attracted me most to having eventually tenure in an academic situation, where after you get tenure, there's this freedom that comes, and it might be that, if you become director, there's a freedom that comes with that, right? Or being the main person. But for me, I was really trying to have a balance between my family life and my academic life. And academia gave me a lot more say, when do I teach? What do I teach? When do I do research? So I would have all my meetings in the afternoons, and in the mornings, I would put time for writing. And I'd be sure that I would be in the mornings there, in the afternoon. That sort of flexibility was very important. What are the challenges and barriers? We are alone. We're making it as we go. We have to break rules. We have to be the first ones. We have to be the ones that are shifting and looking at the systems around us and questioning them. I mean, if you would follow the sort of, that I use, I'm thinking about us as ants. That's my humans as ants. If you follow the route, then there's not that cost to it. There's one in front of you that it's telling you what to do. But most of us are the first ones in our families, are the first ones in our ethnic groups or our groups to do this. So there are many challenges and barriers, but there are challenges and barriers to being in Wall Street. There's challenges and barriers to being, in a medical school and being, head of your department. There's a lot of all this other stuff. So we choose our challenges and our barriers, and that's the choice, hopefully, that you have.
Great, thanks. Thanks, Cynthia. So for me, I even though I had a brief moment of accepting an academic position, I really, I never actually took the position because I got lured away to come to Washington, D.C. for a federal position, but I really never wanted to go in an academic position. And I was really more focused on clinical. And like I said before, I was an accidental tourist. I stumbled into one thing after another. I got my first job at a cocktail party. So I have been very fortunate in some of what has happened, but part of that comes into one of the recommendations that I'm going to have later on, and that is around relationships. But I kind of grew into this non-academic role in that I got lured into the applied policy relevant work. I wanted to do work that mattered to a broader group than the one-on-one that I was doing in clinical work. And I found that for me, and I know everyone has to choose their own path for their own reasons and with their own rationalizations, but for me, that was the opportunity to come in, bring some good, solid, rigorous research work, and apply it in a way that's going to have an impact on program research and policy decision making. It's not necessarily an either or, because Lorena, one of the things that you pointed out about your perception of non-academic careers, that you don't have the ability to choose the kinds of research questions you do that we often think of as the domain of folks in the academic research community. And I always tell people whenever we're hiring new staff that there are really two main pathways, at least in research firms like where I work. You can respond to large, usually federal RFPs for big studies, big national studies. We just won a couple of big national studies, so we're excited about these Head Start studies that we're going to be doing. But the other track is, how are you out there kind of, it's not even breaking the rules, Kevin, it's how are you coloring outside the lines? How are you taking your passion and your skills for an area and saying, here's a question I think needs to be investigated. And here's, I don't know who's going to fund it, but I'm going to find some collaborators. So I'm working with, Kevin and I have had some discussions about doing some research work with Migrant Head Start, some of the work that I've done with Migrant Head Start and some of his interests. Dual language learners. So I'm more likely to say, what are the questions that are of interest that the field needs to address? Issues around dual language learners, issues around assessment of classroom quality in DLL classrooms, those kinds of issues. And then I'm more likely to say, where am I going to find partners to work with on these kinds of efforts? Where am I going to find funding support for that? Sometimes it means starting off with some smaller efforts, then eventually things happen where some of the larger efforts. And so it's kind of being flexible, but being passionate and figuring out kind of the different pieces and how they all fit together. But for me, it's one of the big differences is that in working in a large research organization like where I am now, it's a very collectivistic kind of approach. And I didn't acknowledge all the amazing folks, some of them sitting here in the room with me now, that you'll see on the slides, that really, a great team of people. And it's much more of a collectivistic kind of approach where we're all in this together. It's not about my own accomplishments, me as an individual researcher. And I'm not saying that that's not the case, because I know that a lot of folks in academic settings also do a lot of great collaborative work. But for me, that's like the defining part about being in a large research organization. And that it takes, in order to do some of these big studies, it takes large teams, a lot of different people working together on these large efforts. So that's one of the things, that connection to then being able to translate that into the policy relevant arena has really been what's driven me in terms of the non-academic approach. In the interest of time, let's go to our last set of questions. So looking forward, looking back in terms of your experiences, however short or long they may be, and then looking forward in terms of, as mentors, as we become mentors, how do you think about advice for junior scholars who are themselves exploring different career options? Kevin, why don't you start us off on this one?
Yeah, I'm actually going to build on something that Lorena said earlier, stealing the thunder of informational interviews. It's a practice that I hadn't learned about, and I think until too late, and now I talk a lot to students about. But we already heard a little bit about what that looks like, but I think feeling free to ask people for coffee or for tea or to meet for 30 minutes or an hour with the explicit aim of finding out about their career trajectory, how did they make it to where they are, what does their daily jobs look like, with the explicit understanding that there's no more of a commitment than that. It's not that you're going to hit them up for a job afterwards. It's not that you're going to ask them to use their network on your behalf, but it's for that 30 minutes, an hour. Be the timekeeper, because it's so uncomfortable for the other person, follow up afterwards. But it's a great way to find out about what the realities of different positions look like. And as we heard earlier, I think people are more than happy to do that. And I think for us on the other side, or for those people who are mentoring, being willing to accept those invitations when they come is one way that we can help mentor folks as they come up through the ranks. And I think another piece, and this might be the more millennial side of me and to the chagrin of mentors, but being open to applying to different types of positions. Like I said earlier, I was open to a couple of different types of positions, and I asked and I tried to formulate mentors and letters of recommendation and applications for those different types of positions. And as long as I felt that being organized and being kind of communicative with those folks writing letters for me was very helpful, and allowed me to do that. But I will say I did get, the surprise or the response of, this is not normally how it's done. And I don't know if that is part of the change in the way careers work for younger generations or the lack of certain types of jobs. But I think being open to that and being organized for your mentors and letter writers is important, but feeling that you have the flexibility to maybe think about applying to different types of things at the same time. And then I think doing internships or consulting gigs or finding those other opportunities earlier on in your career, and if you have to color outside the lines to do so. And I think as we heard about coloring outside the lines and breaking the rules, finding ways to be honest with yourself and not lose the integrity that you have around your own interests is something to keep in mind throughout. I felt torn throughout many points in my career thus far to try to mold myself more in the mainstream around the topics that I was interested in looking at or researching, and instead have tried to be really honest. And I tried to give myself the freedom in the job search to say, these are the issues I want to look at, and being honest. Sometimes I think we hedge ourselves and we're like, who's in the room? What can I say? And putting my foot forward in realizing that the career that I might enter may be a long-term career decision. I said, okay, what is really important to me about how I communicate, that I want to work with doing research alongside communities around the issues that they see. And that might only be a piece of my research trajectory, but I want to be honest that that is something I'm interested in. I'm interested in talking about communities of color. I'm interested in talking about migrant communities. And so trying to think about your own integrity and the job opportunity as a way to realign yourself was something that was really important to me, and I feel like has kept me much healthier in my career now than I was as a graduate student.
Cynthia.
So let's talk about historical periods. You talked about millennials. When I look at the job market right now for developmental psychologists, I'm amazed of how many positions are available. And I think there is this notion that, you know, the market is really tough. Well, when I was coming up, there were no jobs. I mean, my first job was created between this and that to be able to be in a place where they thought that I could do something for them. It's a department of pediatrics. I was the first PhD. I was the first person who was asking the kinds of questions that I was doing. I was the first everything. And some of you are being the first right now, but I think that there is a flexibility right now between consulting, being an academic. As you were saying, Kevin, you are an academic, but you are also pursuing other things that are being thought of as important within. So I think there's a flexibility right now within the systems that was not there 10, 20, 30 years ago. And you guys have to take advantage of it. The notion of a linear model of PhD, postdoc, a job, and everything else was a male white model that doesn't work for women, that hasn't worked from anybody else. And that's being now, you know, we're working with family leaves and stuff like that. So think creatively. Think about what you really love to do on a daily basis. Most of us end up doing a lot of things that we don't like to do. But what keeps us going is that we know that in 3 years, in 1 year, in 10 years, we're going to be doing something that is going to make a difference. It might be in 2 weeks that we're going to be working with a migrant family and going to feel good about that. So passion, goals, clarity on what really moves you, what really makes you feel good that you're making a difference. That's what it's all about. It doesn't matter what your advisor tells you, what your other advisors, what your colleagues, or everybody else. It's about you. And that millennials, I know you can deal with that very much, right? And stuff like that. All right. Navigating the process, it's going to be hard, but life is not meant to be easy. And, you know, obstacles are, as a good developmentalist, opportunities for opening up, growing, moving on. And the way that you do that is you hold on with your hands with significant people. That's family, that's networks, that's colleague. In my university at the very beginning, when I was at Brown, I was the only faculty, Hispanic faculty in the whole university. So I couldn't meet with the other faculty of color. So who do I meet? With the academic deans, with a psychologist that was working in other places. We all had the notion of being the only ones in our area. So hold hands while you do your
Great. Thanks, Cynthia. Lorena.
So I think it was already kind of mentioned by Cynthia and Kevin, but definitely if you're on the fence, I would definitely go for an internship. And I know in the federal space, many of them are unpaid, but there's a lot of funding opportunities out there with, whether it be within your university or externally, like, so don't like not look for a position because it's unpaid. Be creative on how you can explore those non-academic, because I think I actually met someone who went the opposite direction. She was interning at NCES and she's like, yeah, I don't want to do the non-academic. I'm going back into academia. So just because you're exploring doesn't mean you're going to go one way or another. It's just depending on how that experience pans out for you. And I also have like advice for mentors. Kind of just be open with your students. You know, when they bring up that conversation about like, well, I'm exploring, I'm not too sure, like, be sure just to be open and don't push back, because being a student and bringing that up to your advisor is already nerve-wracking and challenging, because you're like, well, I don't know how they're going to react. And then like, depending like if you're their first student or, you know, wherever you're at in that grad school process, it could be challenging. So I just advise mentors to be open. And if you're not too sure how to even navigate, you know, be your students like ally and navigate that process with them, because you yourself will also learn something, because you never know, someone else might come up and want to, you know, pursue that route as well. And then I think, as Cynthia said, one of the important things is just that self-reflection process. Really reflect on what is important to you as a researcher, as a person, and like in all aspects, you know, what you want to achieve with your career, but also what you want to career as a personal level, because your life is not just your career. You have a life beyond that. So make sure to like, wherever you're headed, that is also included in that decision.
Great. Thanks, Lorena. So I want to go back to this millennial thing, because this has come up in a number of conversations, and Kevin brought it up, and then Cynthia brought it up. There's a generational issue that goes on here, and I would say that, you know, when I was going into grad school, one of the things, there were two things that really I look back on and I think of were critical factors. One of them was putting in the work, and you know, Cynthia, you kind of mentioned this a little bit, that we all do things that you know, I'm not above doing it, you know, tasks that maybe I shouldn't be doing because it's more costly for me to do it. But you know, the job has to get done. And one of the things that really started me off was basically working really hard with my advisor at the time on a research project, and it was his research project, but I ended up doing my master's out of that. But because of that relationship, some of my classmates, you know, grumbled, and I just, you know, did what I needed to do, you know, to put in the time, do the work as best as possible. And I think that hard work, sometimes people come in and say, well, I want to design a big national study. I just got my PhD. I want to do the next big, you know, Head Start impact study or something like that. And that's just not going to happen. And I think that's a generational thing. And I've heard this from, not just my experience, but I've heard this from other people. You got to come in, you got to be willing to do that work. The second part, and not to sound too much, you know, like too paternalistic on that, but the second part is relationships. And, you know, you've heard this from different people, but it's kind of like when you're buying a house, you know, location, location, location. But in this case, it's relationships, relationships, relationships. I tell people that, you know, I work with some of the smartest people, both in my organization and around the country, with all these great research colleagues, folks on, you know, on the webinar. And the thing that strikes me is that it's not just half of your success is what you know. The other half is who you know, or those relationships. Because you can be the smartest person in the world, but if you don't have those relationships, if you don't develop those relationships, if you don't nurture those relationships, then you are probably not going to be as successful as somebody who does do that. And so, I mean, I can't stress enough the importance of relationships. And then the last piece in terms of advice going forward is that this is a good time to be a researcher. And Cynthia, you kind of touched on, you know, the positions. There's a big wave of the baby boomer retirement that was held off for the recession. So it doesn't matter whether academic or non-academic settings. There are a lot of people who held off on retirement, so there are going to be a lot of positions that are start coming open. That's one thing. So the baby boomer, delayed baby boomer retirement wave is going to start opening up opportunities. The other big factor is evidence-based accountability movement. It's a good time to be a researcher because more and more funders, it's not just you're doing research to do research, but also funders are now requiring that of programs. In order to get their funding, they need to have some evidence base. So it's a good time to be a researcher. And then just the demographics. It's a good time to be a diverse researcher because with the changing demographics, there's greater emphasis on the cultural and linguistic responsiveness of the work that we do. And so those of us who are in that category, you going from what you heard where you might be the only person or it might be a more, I've had that experience both when I was in the federal government and otherwise, where there was a lot of pressure. I was the only Latino voice in the room. Still happens from time to time, but given the increasing diversity, there's more and more of a demand for diverse voices and diverse perspectives within the research community. So it's a good time to take advantage of all that, and it's a good time to also then think about all these other dynamics that people talked about, and in terms of what does that mean for your career decision making. So I think we have just a couple minutes left. We'll take a couple questions. I know that some of the things that we've gotten a few questions from folks, and I think that we've answered a few of these already. But one question, and I think the one question I'd like to throw out for a quick response that came in is, if you take a job outside of academia, following grad school or postdoc, can you go back on the job market at a later time? And I'm assuming that people are thinking about, if I go to a non-academic job, can I go back to an academic job? And how do you think search committees view candidates who've taken time off to work outside of academia? So Cynthia, this is probably likely falls closer on you. I've got a few thoughts, but maybe you can give a quick answer to that.
I know many of my peers went into postdocs, they went into federal jobs and stuff like that, and eventually came back to academia. What's the rule? You need to be involved in research and in publishing. The publishing part, and it can be as a part of a group, or it can be by yourself or whatever. You need to have a publication record. You need to have a publication track. And how do you do that? You collaborate. You're always, as I say to my students, you think you're doing research until you publish it. If you haven't published it, you're not very end. And if we don't publicize so yes, it's possible. It took me 13 years to get
Cynthia, you're breaking up a bit, but just in the interest of time, because we're just about out of time, but I wanted to thank our panelists for all your great thoughts, for joining us and sharing, and all the participants. This session will be archived on the Hispanic Center website. We also are developing a related resource guide that has a link. There are a lot of things out there. And then there is you'll see on here, there's a collaborative mentoring network forum on LinkedIn that we support. And if you look down here on your screen, please join this, because we will have information on, this is the kind of forum where we have a lot of these kinds of topics that come up. And I think that some of the questions that came up, I'd like to pose them on the forum and have people join in and weigh in on some of this. But thank you, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.